It was 2020 when yet another strange disappearance occurred in California in one of its many rather beautiful national forests. A disappearance that started turning heads, but it was a more recent twist that really sent chills down anyone's spines who followed the story to any degree. As the Madera County Sheriff's Office, who themselves had been tasked with digging into the situation from the start, were left utterly befuddled, confounded, and confused by what they kept running into. This is a sad story of Sandra Hughes Johnsen, and it all began on March 11th, 2020, when the World Health Organization officially declared the disease that cannot be named a global pandemic, as governments around the world began to tell people to stay home, limit contact, all in order to try to slow the spread. Now, whether that actually happened, worked, or was based on anything beyond suppositions, I'm not going to inquire into. But what I can say is that everyone hoped these measures would work fast. But 3 months in, cases were still climbing, and it became clear that COVID would eventually just become endemic. It wasn't a simple problem that you could fix by hunkering down, hiding under a desk, and begging for it to go away. It was something significantly more complicated and that it would take a lot longer to deal with, or just get used to. For most regular people, the main issue, it was the practical. Eventually it would become rather political, but at least in the early onset, it wasn't. They were asking themselves, how do we retain some shred of normalcy when you're functionally stuck at home or isolated from everyone else? This was a question that 54-year-old Sandra Hughes was asking herself at the time, as her life hadn't gone exactly how she had planned. She had been married twice, both times ending in divorce, and she had sired no heirs. At that time, she was living in Hawaii, a rather beautiful place, potentially second only to my favorite island, but she hadn't been there for any significant amount of time to lay down roots, so it wasn't really feeling like home. Now, it is important for this story to visualize Sandra. This was a 5'3", generally healthy woman weighing around 150 pounds. Her hair was brown, which had been either dyed or tipped some shade of blue, and she had brown eyes. By June of 2020, Sandra was in a rather reflective mindset, thinking about what her life had become and what she wanted from it. She wasn't alone in feeling this way, as many people during that time, and due to the effects of the lockdowns, to this day, were influenced by isolation and uncertainty. But for Sandra, the choices she made next put her on a one-way track to the crossroads in a way that no one could have predicted. Before all of this had started, Sandra had lived a relatively nomadic life, moving around the entirety of the country without really staying anywhere too long. She worked as an accountant. However, this was not what she truly desired. She had studied and focused things surrounding wilderness survival. This was a subject she truly loved from the bottom of her heart. Sandra had all her life been an avid outdoorsman or outdoorswoman, an enthusiast of the wildlands of America, ever since she was a small youngin', and at one point, she even dreamed of becoming a park ranger. That dream had fueled her passions further and further still, all the way throughout college. However, upon graduation, reality hit her, as she was set on a path that was rather different than what she originally desired, becoming an accountant. Looking back, she couldn't have picked a more different life path to her passion if she had been intentionally doing so. Fast forward a few decades, and Sandra found herself on a reflective journey, especially due to the quarantine of 2020, giving her a rather unique opportunity to reconnect with her beloved outdoors. Seeing the pause in normalcy as an opportunity rather than a restriction, she made a rather bold, if not unwise move. And by the end of June, she sold her home in the beautiful Maui and relocated to Madera County, California, nestled in the heart of the very wealthy state. Madera, coincidentally, lies south of the beautiful Yosemite National Park and somewhat north of the Sierra National Forest, which is simultaneously a perfect spot for someone wanting to immerse themselves in the beauty and grandeur of nature, or an ideal spot to accidentally vanish, like many have before. On June 26th, after settling into her new home, Sandra told her family about her plan for an extended solo trip into the Sierra National Forest, and she promised that she would remain in touch during the coming weeks. For Sandra, this wasn't just a trip, it was a once-in-a-lifetime adventure, a chance to find true happiness and fulfillment while following the quarantine guidelines, essentially being alone and as far away from human contact, regardless of how bad that is for your mental state, as possible. This is because we are social creatures. Regardless of how antisocial you are, you at your core as a human or a social animal. Shortly after speaking with her family, Sandra loaded her camping gear into her silver vehicle and set off, driving south in her Saab, then further east for an hour to an hour and a half, eventually reaching the more remote areas of the Sierra National Forest. At some point, she decided to leave the main road and take a rugged path that wound through the forest, arriving at what many refer to as a picturesque area known as Johnsen Meadows. The Johnsen Meadows are regarded as being some of the most breathtaking vistas available in the Sierra National Forest, something you'd see straight out of a movie. Lush green meadows framed by dense forests from the aptly named Sierra National Forest. Beyond the trees, you can see the faint outlines of the snow cap at the peaks of the Sierra Nevadas. But as stunning as Johnsen Meadows is, wilderness areas, especially when you disregard the ever-important buddy system, which under no circumstances should be ignored, is not without its risks. The area is rather remote and isolated, and home to somewhat dangerous wildlife such as cougars, bears, and other natural hazards, including potential heat injuries, falling logs, and the dreaded coyote. While these smaller animals might not seem as dangerous, being so friend-shaped, the intellect of a coyote is nothing to scoff at, as they have learned to trick humans into following them deeper into the woods, where they can attack as a pack. After supposedly parking her Saab at the very edge of the meadow, making sure it was just off the road enough so it wouldn't be a hazard to anyone driving, Sandra supposedly gathered her belongings from the trunk. With her camping gear on her back, she began hiking towards the heart of the meadow, searching for just the right spot to set up camp. It would be 6 days later, on July 2nd, that a group of hikers emerged from the trees into Johnsen Meadows. As they crossed the open expanse, they spotted a tent and a campsite in the distance. At first, it looked deserted, which wasn't unusual for such an area in the woods, but as they got closer, something felt not quite right. The campsite itself seemed to be in disarray, as if a veritable typhoon had passed through the area, but it hadn't. This led curiosity to get the better of them. Unfortunately for the group, curiosity did not kill the cat this time. As they approached, they found a backpack which was overturned and its contents spilled out, scattered across the ground, with unopened cans of food, a litany of paper, and other documents strewn about haphazardly. The tent itself was noted to be useless by at least one source, damaged beyond belief. In essence, it was ruined, almost looking like the aftermath of an animal attack, or perhaps people rummaging around trying to find something or someone. Puzzled and understandably uneasy, the hikers decided that regardless of what caused this mess, they had to tell someone. So they booked it. Taking some rather intelligent precautions, they marked the location on a map before leaving the forest and getting away from potentially whatever could have caused what was left behind there. After returning to civilization, the hikers immediately contacted the Madera County Sheriff's Office to report what they had found. Later that same day, deputies ventured into Johnson's Meadows, following the hikers' direction and getting to the spot that they had marked on their map. What they discovered matched the report, if not exceeding it slightly. The campsite was indeed abandoned and in a complete state of disarray, along with the area looking eerily desolate, nary a sign of life anywhere around. During the search, deputies would go on to find ID cards belonging to Sandra Hughes. With that confirmation, the sheriff's deputies left the forest and contacted Sandra's family in order to try and understand why the campsite had been left in such a state and hopefully to acquiesce if Sandra had contacted them. What they learned was that this was incredibly unusual if she had been okay or alive, as Sandra had always been extremely environmentally conscious, along with being rather meticulous about her cleanliness whenever going into the woods. The family believed there was no way she would have left the campsite in such a state intentionally. They insisted that something else must have happened. Her family would also reveal that they hadn't heard hide nor hair from Sandra since June 26th, the day she had set off for the trip, which meant that they had no idea where she might be. Naturally, they were both concerned and suspicious. On that very day, an official missing persons report would be filed. Over the next 2 days, an extensive search operation was launched into the Johnsen Meadows area, alongside the surrounding regions. Hundreds upon hundreds of volunteers combed the forest on foot, aided by trained search dog teams while helicopters scanned from above, as the Madera County Sheriff's Office also interviewed anyone they came across, including hikers, campers, and individuals who were just walking by the road leading up to the area during the time, who might have just coincidentally made contact with Sandra during her trip or just afterward. Her recently died or tipped blue hair would have made her relatively easy to spot and identify. However, despite all these efforts, after 2 days of intensive searching, the authorities still had no leads on Sandra's whereabouts. Then, on the 4th of July, 2 days after her disappearance, Sandra was reportedly sighted by some hikers in Johnsen, Meadows. As they made their way through the meadows itself, it seems that they had noticed a woman standing alone at the edge. She was barefooted, wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. They also noted that she had a strange, visible bruise on her face, along with that despite her solitary presence, she didn't appear distressed or in need of aid. She was just observing her surroundings and made no attempt to signal or contact the hikers in any way, shape, or form. It wasn't until the hikers reached the parking lot that they realized the significance of what they had seen. They had spotted missing persons flyers for Sandra Hughes and immediately recognized the barefoot woman in the meadow, matching her description almost to a T. This led them to promptly notifying the Madera County Sheriff's Office, who quickly responded to the sightings. However, when deputies arrived at the location, Sandra was gone, and any trace of an individual matching said description being in the area also vanished. The following day, on the 5th of July, authorities discovered Sandra's vehicle. However, somewhat fortunately, she was not inside. Her Saab had been found around 5 miles north of the destroyed campsite, nestled, or rather placed, at the bottom of a ravine beside a winding forest road. Examinations of the vehicle revealed that the front end was damaged, leading investigators to surmise that Sandra might have potentially collided with a tree then rolled down the embankment. As there was no blood found inside, it left authorities wondering whether the accident had caused any physical harm to her, or if for some reason the vehicle had gotten out of her control and she avoided being inside as it crashed. The specific area that was reported where her vehicle was found was in Chiquito Lake Trailhead, and the vehicle was specifically spotted by a non-profit off-road team. After the vehicle's discovery, the mystery only seemed to deepen further still. At this point, authorities and her family were left grappling with more questions than answers, such as where had Sandra gone after being spotted in the meadow, and had she been spotted in the meadow before or after the car had crashed, or had the car been crashed after her disappearance. However, the most alarming discovery would come from the state of Sandra's personal belongings within the car. It appeared that after her vehicle had come to a halt at the bottom of the ravine, someone or something had rifled through her belongings, scattering them across the forest floor. Some sources state that it almost looked like as if whomever or whatever was there had been searching for something. And it was noted that the scene was rather unsettling, as it mirrored the utter and complete chaos and devastation that had occurred at Sandra's campsite, where her possessions were once again strewn about and left on the floor. The Madera County Sheriff's Office couldn't shake the eerily similarities between the two locations, and theories began to percolate. Potentially, some would question if Sandra had been found by someone and they had been looking for a particular item or resources, taken the car and left. However, there was no direct evidence pointing to this as of yet. At this point, authorities didn't even suspect that Sandra could have potentially been deliberately avoiding them. Instead, they considered the possibility that she might have been injured either at the campsite or during a car accident, both of which could have affected her cognitive abilities. A general, more believable theory emerged that she might have been disoriented and lost in the woods, unaware of her surroundings, and while foul play was briefly considered as mentioned above, it was largely dismissed, as there were no evidence of blood or a weapon of any kind. This led to a decision to leave Sandra's vehicle undisturbed at the bottom of the ravine, with some hopes that she might return to it. Authorities thought that leaving it in place could help her if she ever came back to the location. They also left a note beside Sandra's window, urging her to contact them if she saw it, along with a heartfelt message from her family expressing just how much they wanted her to return. The search for Sandra would continue in the days that followed with renewed focus, in particular around the area where the vehicle had been found rather than around the campsite. Volunteers and deputies were called upon once again to comb the forest. However, unfortunately, it seems that no new leads would emerge, as the scattered belongings and the abandoned campsite were all that was found of this vanished hiker. Then, on July the 12th, a search team ventured around 2.5 miles north of Sandra's vehicle, leading them into the area generally considered part of Yosemite National Park, another hotbed for disappearances. They found themselves near Spotted Lake, an area that was inaccessible by main roads or trailhead. primarily defined by its rugged, unforgiving terrain, where more challenging hikers decided to test themselves. It is to the point that they were forced to navigate the landscape with flashlights, as the team would eventually stumble upon a sleeping bag laying out in the open, and, most excitingly of all, it appeared to have been recently used. Subsequent investigations confirmed that this was the sleeping bag that had belonged to Sandra. But despite the searchers' best efforts of scouring the surrounding areas, including the remote zones around Spotted Lake, Sandra and potentially her remains, stayed as completely elusive specters. At this point, authorities were hitting a brick wall. On the map, the locations of Johnsen Meadows, Sandra's vehicle, and the sleeping bag formed a straight line, gradually moving northwards. This led to the realization that Sandra might have been traveling this terrain barefoot, without proper equipment, over the steep cliffs and rugged landscapes, straight through wildlife territories, where she could have encountered cougars, bears, or a myriad of other critters that could have been extremely hazardous for her well-being. Authorities now understood that Sandra's survival window was rapidly closing. Even if she had chosen to embark on this journey intentionally, the harsh elements and the dangerous conditions of this area posed a great risk to her overall well-being and that of the searchers. Search efforts would continue for another week following the discovery of the sleeping bag. However, once again, no new leads emerged, as Sandra remained missing, leaving both her family and authorities frustrated, worried, along with being increasingly baffled by the strange and seemingly deliberate northern progression of her trail. By the 20th of July, there were still no signs of Sandra or any fresh leads, as authorities reluctantly had to scale back their efforts. However, on August 9th, about a few weeks after all this had occurred, two hunters driving down a remote road several miles east of where Sandra's car had been found spotted something as they rounded a corner. They saw a woman. She wasn't on the road proper, not even close to it. Instead, it seemed that this individual was nestled further up on the hillside amongst the trees, leaning against a tree trunk. The hunters quickly noticed that she had no equipment, no backpack, no tent, and that there were no signs of other people around her. In such an isolated area, encountering anyone was unusual, let alone a lone woman casually leaning against a tree, by herself, completely ignoring the buddy system. Concerned for her well-being, the hunters stopped their vehicle a short ways away from her, and they called out, waving and hollering at her. Unfortunately, she did not respond, as she seemed lost in her own thoughts, gazing out into the distance. Since she did not appear to be injured or distressed, the hunters eventually decided to continue on their merry way, leaving her in her own chosen solitude. Later that day, after spotting missing persons flyers for Sandra Hughes, the hunters realized that the woman they had seen was indeed her, or at least appeared extremely like the individual pictured in the posters. Immediately, they decided to contact Madera County Sheriff's Office in order to report the sightings. According to their description, Sandra was wearing overalls with a floral t-shirt and appeared to be visibly thinner than the photo on the flyer. The change of her appearance immediately caught the sheriff's attention. When she had last been seen on July the 4th, on the 4th of July, near Johnsen Meadows, she had been barefoot and with a bruise on her face, wearing a backpack and blue jeans. The fact that this individual had potentially changed their outfit despite having lost all their belongings at the campsite and, further still, in her car, puzzled authorities and her family further still. The whole situation was increasingly peculiar, leaving authorities baffled and concerned for her safety. There were even some rumblings that she might have been taken in by a group or an individual who had been supplying her or keeping her in a certain way for nefarious ends. However, there was little to no evidence pointing to something such as this, so authorities largely dismissed this theory. Despite authorities checking where the hunters had found the individual, Sandra was nowhere near that. There were no signs of Sandra being anywhere around that area at the time. No traces of her presence even. Following this encounter, her case went cold, leaving authorities and her family resigned to the grim possibility that they may never find her. Later still, in September of that same year, the Creek Fire, one of California's larger wildfires, burned through areas of the Sierra National Forest, including the regions previously searched for Sandra. This development necessitated a reevaluation of any potential further search efforts, and the possibility that any evidence that may have remained now had been largely destroyed or permanently altered by the fires. However, Less than a year later, on July 21st, 2021, something rather eerie occurred. An individual known as Jake Gorba, accompanied by his wife Victoria and their 3 young children, went for a drive in Jake's off-road capable vehicle into the steep forest roads at the heart of the Sierra National Forest. And as the family navigated the bumpy road leading to their destination, the kids in the back started complaining that they were hungry, they were bored, etc., just like children tend to do. This led Jake and Victoria to agree to stop for a quick snack. Finding a suitable spot, they planned to continue the rest of the way after their kids had filled their bellies and stretched their legs for a short time. However, as fate would have it, the road seemed to level off a lot quicker than they had expected, leading them to a short, flat section across a mountain, nestled within a stretch of picturesque meadow below the dense tree line. Jake and Victoria immediately recognized this as a perfect spot for a quaint little picnic. As Jake steered the truck to the side of the road, then proceeded to park and turned off the vehicle, ready to enjoy this slight respite from the rougher areas of the wilderness, they began to gather their belongings for their picnic lunch, when suddenly they heard their 3-year-old son chanting excitedly from the back seat near the window. It seems Jake and Victoria turned to see who he was talking to, only to find him engaged in a seemingly intense conversation with someone outside the open window. Gazing across the meadow towards the tree line and the forest, it seemed that they could not find whatever had their child's attention, leading Victoria to gently ask Caden who he was talking to. Turning away from the window, Caden looked at his mom with a serious expression. "There is a woman there," he said, pointing out, "and she needs help." Jake and Victoria quickly followed their son's gaze, peering into the tree line. Unfortunately, they saw nothing. Turning back to their son, they explained gently that they didn't see anyone out there. But the kid's urgency grew further and further still, telling them that they had to trust him, that she's right there and that she needs their help. He went on to even state that she was laying facing down with her legs being straight up, potentially being dead. Without hesitation, Jake would dash into the woods, determined to investigate and see what their child had found. Victoria, however, would remain in the car, anxiously waiting and watching over the kids, as Caden continued pointing out the window, describing the woman in distress. Jake would search frantically throughout the nearby area around the forest, scanning every tree and every shadow. However, his efforts would yield nothing. Confused and unsettled, he returned to the vehicle. Caden, still insistent, continued pointing towards the tree line, describing a woman as if she were right there and in real need of help, even though no one could see her. Feeling uneasy, Jake and Victoria decided to leave the area. Shaken up by the inexplicable events unfolding, they decided to head home. That night, Victoria took to social media, sharing their rather disturbing experience, including a description of the woman based on Caden's account. A figure wearing a black t-shirt with blue jeans, sporting striking blue hair. However, it is important to note, and this is a rather big detail, that as a year had passed, there was almost no way that she would still have had blue hair. If the toddler was seeing anything, or anyone, either it wasn't her, or it was something of the supernatural persuasion. However, it is also important to note how closely accurate the description the child gave was. Yet we must also consider that the child could have potentially seen one of the posters earlier and have had visualized the woman in a manner similar to how one would visualize an imaginary friend at such an age, potentially with a mix of pareidolia, aka the psychological tendency to perceive familiar patterns, such as faces or living beings, in random ambiguous stimuli, like rocks, static, shadows, or a vaguely wooded area across a tree line. Eventually, upon seeing Victoria's posts describing a woman matching Sandra's appearance, the Madera County Sheriff's Office recognized a potential significance, to the point that they would go out to meet the Gorba family, and deputies would go on to present Caden with a lineup of several women, including pictures of Sandra Hughes, and asked him to identify the woman he had seen in the woods. Surprisingly, without any prompting, Caden selected 3 pictures, and all 3 of them were indeed of Sandra Hughes. Determined to unravel the mystery, the sheriffs accompanied Caden and his father, returning to the area near where the child had spotted the woman in order to search for clues. Despite the authorities' best efforts, they found nothing. As of today, Sandra's whereabouts remain completely unknown. Her case has left authorities and the local community, along with some of the more sleuthy areas of the internet, grappling with unanswered questions and deeply unsettled by the strange encounters. From her initial disappearance in Johnsen, Meadows, to her mysterious sightings reported by the Gorba family, and even the events of the fire, everything surrounding Sandra's vanishing continues to befuddle everyone involved, and it remains one of the Sierra National Forest's more puzzling mysteries. As time passes, the case of Sandra Hughes remains a rather haunting reminder of the dangers that going out into the wilderness without at least following the buddy system can truly be. And unfortunately, until concrete answers or more evidence emerges, her story will continue to both be captivating and unsettling to anyone who encounters it, leaving many to wonder if there could be something unknown lurking in the shadowed areas of the Sierra National Forest. If you enjoyed this video, leaving a like would be awesome. It helps show YouTube that, these videos aren't brain rot, and subscribing would be a great way to stay up to date whenever I post a new video. To close things off, I would like to thank you for staying with me until the end.